Hello, folks. Real pleasure to have Jyoti Banerjee today. I met Jyoti, God, probably a quarter of a century ago. We both have aged reasonably well. I knew him as a finance and accounting wizard, a publisher, an analyst, and so on. But a recent conversation, I learned he's been doing a lot of stuff in the whole environmental, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, the green space. So I invited him to present on what he's been doing. Jyoti, thank you for joining me. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Vinnie, it's been great to catch up again after quite a few years. And I think you're being generous in terms of how well I'm doing. You certainly seem to be doing all right. I've had a couple of meetings with the doctors along the way. But enjoying the gift of life and health. So all of that's positive. You're right. When we connected probably 25 years ago for the first time, we were both messing around with technology and meeting vendors and doing that kind of thing. I stepped away from that probably a lot sooner than you did. In fact, I'm not sure that you ever did. But but for me, I've had a career over the last 20 years, I guess, being involved in investment in companies that are committed to making an impact in the worlds in which they operate, and that's been really exciting. Really, it's been a learning curve for me. Over 60 investments that we made, and in 18 different countries. And what I would say from that is that if you're going to have a business that's committed to making a return for the shareholders, but is also thinking about another objective, like making a difference in the communities in which you operate, etc., it becomes a real challenge managing multiple objectives. But actually, in many ways, I think that's what business is going to be about going forward. And we all need to learn how that works. So I've had some early lessons, if you like, in that whole experience. But I also spent the last 10 years exploring how corporate reporting could change, and was involved in the team that created the corporate reporting movement, described as integrated reporting, which is really a holistic approach to corporate reporting, bringing together not just the return on financial capital,
Sure.
but every business uses other forms of resources, like, and we call them capitals: human capital, natural capital, relationship capital, social capital. And very few businesses are able to explain the return they make on those capitals. And usually they sacrifice those capitals on the altar of financial capital. And so this was an effort to get large corporates to tell a more rounded story of what their performance actually looks like. And
So really
today,
stakeholder capitalism, not just shareholder capitalism.
yeah, but I think it's stakeholder capitalism sometimes makes you think that it's only the stakeholders who count and they're an alternative for the shareholders, whereas actually I think we need a fuller rounded picture.
Okay.
And so integrated reporting over the last 7 years since we introduced it has got something like 2,500 listed companies around the world who use it. But I look back at what I've been involved in over the last 20 years or so, and thought at the end of last year, I thought, you know what? In many ways, the world is still the same as it ever was. People still focus on making money in their companies. And yes, there are people at the margins doing some things that cause less harm, etc. But really, how can we change the world? And that's what ended up in the creation of my new venture.
Well, Jyoti, I think you're an optimist, but probably not as optimistic as I am. I look at how many have 500 million people in China have moved from dirt poverty to the middle class. I look at India. A lot of good has happened in the last 20, 30 years. And so we can't just, I look forward to your presentation, but it'd be an interesting conversation to talk about balancing growth versus other responsibilities.
You're absolutely right. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen more people come out of poverty than possibly in the history of mankind. The challenge we have is that the model we've used to enable that development process, which is a growth model is not allowing us to do some other things, including we're getting to the point where with the climate emergency and biodiversity loss, we're actually threatening our ability to live on this planet. So for me, I don't want to in any way diminish what has been achieved, but let's also ask the question, can we continue doing it this way? Do we need another model? So that's the driving question for me.
Great. Well, look forward to your presentation.
So Vinnie, I want to tell you about North Star Transition. That's my new venture. And I want to explore why we are doing North Star Transition, because to me, the idea of a North Star is something that we would navigate by. And sailors have used that for centuries. And we think we need a new North Star to navigate by. The way we run our global system, it's running to a navigation star that's taking us to a bad place. And we think it's a transition process because we don't want to simply, cut off the heads of the leaders and create a revolution. But we need to shift in a meaningful way from where we are today to where we'd like to get to. So I want to walk you through the process of why this has got constructed. To me, when you think about the serious existential crises that we face, I think of the climate emergency, I think of biodiversity loss, and I think of social inequalities. And they're very, very serious things at the moment. And, I've put a chart there which shows what carbon dioxide has looked like over the last 800,000 years. And we've never crossed the number of around 300 parts per million on carbon dioxide. But now we're just racing forward. We've crossed 400 in, and it's just a straight upward curve. So when people say to me, but we're doing loads of really good things to stop the various problems we face and to call a halt to the crises, I want to ask the question, show me on this chart where your initiative is. Are you really making that much of a difference? Because I can't see the evidence of it. Now, you could accuse me of being overly negative about what we're doing. And I'd like to recognize that we need to be really, really pessimistic about the risks that we bear. Otherwise, what's the point of doing risk management? And I hope we can be really, really optimistic about what we can achieve, in which case it's worth living and it's worth carrying out the actions we want to carry out. So that's kind of what drives my interest is, we think we're in a really bad place. What can we do about it? And I also want to just give you a sense of the scale of the problem is not just about climate and biodiversity, etc. But as humanity, we decided that something that was worth doing were the Sustainable Development Goals. And we set a target that by 2030, we're going to have these 17 different development goals and we're going to achieve them. And this is going to be our way of dealing with the poverty and inequality that we face on the planet. And whether you believe in these goals or not, and I'm probably one who doesn't, but it's a measure that many people are using. I see investors are talking about how their investment portfolios are working against SDGs. I see companies reporting against what they're doing against the SDGs. Now, someone who tracks the 2,000 largest companies in the world is the World Benchmarking Alliance. And they when you look at their data, what they're basically saying is the very best of the best of the best when it comes to doing the work in terms of achieving the SDGs. They're probably about 5% of the way into this journey. And this is a journey that started in 2015. It's supposed to be done by 2030. Let's say we're a third of the way. If the best of the best are only at 5%, where does that leave the rest of us? Really, really far behind. So in effect, when we have big global challenges that we go for, we hope that these challenges will be achieved one day, but we don't necessarily start well. And the trouble with things like climate and biodiversity loss is we can't wait to the end. Of course, at the moment, you're seeing all sorts of countries coming up and saying, we're going to be net zero by 2050. I live in the United Kingdom, which was the very first country to put it into law to say by 2050, we're going to be net zero on carbon. And that's a very brave and big statement. but others are doing the same. Even China has just put forward their NDC for the Paris Accord, and they're claiming that they're going to be net zero by 2060. So all sorts of commitments being made, but I want to know what's happening on the ground that's going to get us anywhere close to that. And I really question that. So that's part of our challenge. And I see you want to get a word in here, Vinny.
No, you know, like you, I've traveled the world, and the more I travel the world, the more I realize how hypocritical leaders tend to be, right? Well, no, I mean, you know, you talk about reducing poverty and so on, and yet everyone looks to the US, UK, maybe a couple of other countries to allow immigration. We never asked Japan why they take zero immigrants. We never asked Saudi Arabia why they take zero immigrants. Trade is another way to, you know, improve economic status. Why does the US have to keep running trade deficits decade after decade? Why isn't Germany? Why isn't Japan? Why isn't China? Right? So the problem is we have we tend to beat up on a couple of countries and ignore that in the last 20, 25 years. Most countries have reached parity in terms of at least total economic muscle. And we need to expect more from everybody. And we just don't have the guts to do that. We don't have the guts to challenge Putin. How come you're still using coal or Modi? But you know, people will, even though the U.S. emissions have gone down for the last 5, 7, 8 years, everyone looks at the U.S. as a bad boy, right? So I think it's a very hypocritical world, and you and I should be criticizing everybody, not just picking on one or two folks to lead. So,
And it's a nuanced issue because yes, we need to make sure that everyone's moving, because if your room in the house is burning and I'm not doing anything about it, our whole house burns down anyway. So you know we can't pick and choose who we go after. But there are some countries that have had the benefit of having had longer at the use of carbon, etc. And that creates a sense of responsibility and accountability to
Jyoti,
me.
at this point, if you're serious about this, you can't write free checks to anybody. You got to demand from everybody. You know, I mean, the Chinese and the Indians and the other developing countries got breaks from Paris. Oh, you're developing countries. They never, you know, I mean, if you look at how they evolved their transportation systems, they skipped horse buggies. They went straight to automobiles and buses and trains, right? If you look at telecom, they skipped landline. They went straight to mobile. Why can't they skip coal and fossils and go straight to renewables? I mean,
Yeah,
why are we giving them a cop out?
we shouldn't, and we shouldn't give ourselves a cop out either.
Right.
There's no no one gets a free ride on this, and we need to make sure that we keep the feet to the fire on this all around. And for me, I was asking the question, you know, we know so much of what's going wrong. Why can't we do anything about it? Why does it feel like nothing changes? And my hypothesis was this: that the human system that's draped across planet Earth is actually a collection of systems. We live in a complex adaptive system. It takes the changes that happen in one corner of the system and it absorbs them, and nothing changes about the rest of the system because the system knows how to absorb this change. So the question then becomes not how can we deal with climate or how can we deal with biodiversity in the Amazon or something like that. It's how do you enable change across a system that doesn't want to change, because the system is in a super equilibrium. It's working beautifully well in the way it was intended to work, but that way cannot continue. So now how do we shift it out of that way? And that's in effect the challenge that I want to explore with North Star transition. And for me, one of the ideas that has been inspirational for me were talking to climate scientists who were talking about tipping change. So climate scientists are very focused on the idea that you can see change happening in the Amazon, but actually that change results in the melting of the Arctic ice because of the way our planet is interconnected. The different geographical systems of our planet work together, and they're interconnected. And once the Arctic ice melts, it forces new circulation patterns across the Atlantic, and that causes problems in the North Atlantic, in the North American arboreal forest. So whatever it is, one change drives another change, and it pushes us from one equilibrium set to another equilibrium set, quite often in very negative ways. And I wanted to ask the question, because we live on a connected system anyway, in social and human economic terms, what if it was possible to create tipping points that took us to better places of equilibrium rather than worse? Okay, the geographical ones are going to take us to worse places, but can we do something different with our social, human, economic systems? And that was the idea that really got me thinking about how change can occur. And I'm going to share with you one example of the kinds of change process that we're involved in. Remember, we're a pandemic baby. We're a young organization. We're 8 or 9 months old. I'm going to give you a case study about systemic change in the country of Wales. But let's face it, we've only been doing this for 4 or 5 months, so we haven't created that systemic change. We are walking through the process of how it works. And I want to share with you the ideas about how change can work. And I think it's significant to explore how change works because it's all about innovation. How do you actually drive innovation at a systemic level? I'm not interested in how XYZ CEO now starts selling their stuff on the net when before they didn't, because we learned how to do that 25 years ago, but it just didn't become commonplace. But how do we actually create systemic innovation? And that, for me, is a challenge that it doesn't matter what domain you operate in around planet Earth, it doesn't matter what your skill set is, you probably have a job to do in terms of driving systemic innovation. Because when I talk to the folks sitting in Wales, one of the things that people said to me was, the land and the environment is being ruined. It's being ruined by farmers because they're making really bad choices in terms of land management, in terms of agricultural practice. So I'd look at who's saying that to me, and it's usually the environmentalists who are saying that to me. So then I thought, let's go and talk to the farmers and see what they think about this. And their response was, yeah, you know what? Our land management practices are probably not doing a great job for the environment. But by the way, that's not our problem. Our big problem is going to be how we deal with cheap food that comes to Britain once Britain has exited from the European Union. And now we're going to have these Brexit trade deals with America and with New Zealand and Australia. And what's on offer from those countries is cheap food. Cheap food, but the chicken's going to be chlorinated, the food's going to be genetically modified. We're not going to be able to compete with that stuff. And so I thought, okay, fine, let's go talk to the government people and see, does it matter if the Welsh farmers can't compete? And the answer I got was, forget about these Welsh farmers. Who needs them? Because we can buy cheap food elsewhere in the world. So why not just sacrifice the farmers? And also, by the way, in case you're thinking of saving these farmers, what you should be aware of is that the UK has committed to being net zero on carbon by 2050. And agriculture contributes about 1/5 of our emissions. So if we have less farmers, it's better for our emissions. And I was asking the question, wait a minute, are you telling me it's better to buy cheap lamb from New Zealand and ship it literally across the world? And that's going to be better for our carbon footprint? And the answer from a government perspective is, yeah, that's right, because that lamb is New Zealand's problem. It's not our
But Jyoti,
problem
isn't that
when it comes to the carbon calculation. So it's good for us.
A little bit of an indictment of the reporting that you're suggesting? You've set out metrics, and they're delivering to those metrics by taking the shortcuts that you're talking about, right? Isn't that
well? I don't think it's an indictment of holistic forms of reporting. If you've got a holistic form of reporting, that doesn't mean you just add carbon to your reporting and then make all the decisions based on carbon, because in effect, what happened after this, and let me tell you about the conversations that followed on, because I went to the water industry and said, how do you feel about the fact that we won't have farmers in Wales? And they said, you can't do that because in the upper catchment areas, the farmers hold the water. And if we lose that, we'll have flooding downstream. So I go to the insurance companies and say, how do you feel about how about paying for the flooding that's going to happen because we're not able to hold water in the upper catchment areas? And they were like, why do we have to pay for this? And then I talked to the guys in the health industry and I said, so if we get food that has, lower nutrient values, does that matter to you? And they were like, well, you know what? We get to spend the money on the health stuff, but we don't get to have a voice on food. So actually what we're seeing is the same conversation where everybody has a different view. And if you just look at my little domain, I can make a brilliant decision. But you know what? My brilliant decision is probably going to be absolutely lousy for you because that's how these kinds of decisions work.
I think, Jyoti, you're making the point I made on the global scale, right? Everybody worries about their own little domain, right? And nobody wants to be generous. I mean, I've had countless conversations with Germans on how come you don't allow more imports,
Mhm.
right? You expect us to buy, oh, because the products are superior, is the attitude. No, it's not true. I mean, if you're going to help the world, you got to open up, just like we've opened up for a long, long time, right? So everybody is selfish and looks at their little part of the world.
Everybody looks at it, but that's the problem with living on a planet which is interconnected, is that we then end up with this need to change how our system works. And we need to bring everybody's perspective into play. So what we've done with the Wales Transition Lab is we've brought together around 35 leaders from across food and farming and health and from environment and insurance and retail and business and finance. And it's about bringing them together so that they can hear each other, perhaps for the first time, to realize there's no simple pat answer. There isn't a single person in the world who knows the answer to how to resolve the way Wales works or doesn't work. What we need to do is find a method by which we can create innovation. What would that innovation look like that allows the environmentalists and the farmers and the insurance people and the health guys and all of them to come up with a solution that actually makes sense and delivers better outcomes for the people of Wales. So that's what we have done with the transition lab process that we have constructed. Um, I, if you're interested, we can explore how a transition lab process actually works. But what we're trying to do is set really big ambitions for change, uh, and then ask the question: how would we actually engineer the processes so that we can deliver that change at a
And,
nation
and,
scale level, not in one company, but at nation scale level?
and you're bringing in system thinking, right?
Well,
Do one thing and
yeah.
expect something else. And yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I trained as an economist, and as an economist, the training is really to try and narrow down to say two variables, and they're touching against each other, and you want to know what's the impact of that, of these two variables, and you keep everything else the same. And I realized that thinking has so infected the way we work that we pretend we can actually keep everything the same. But when I talk to the ecologists, their basic thinking is completely opposite. They ask the question, if this changes, what else changes? How many other things will shift? And I'm beginning to feel that really I'm coming with the wrong kind of equipment as far as training goes, because I bring this narrow economist mindset where I'm trying to narrow it down to a model that I can understand and work, when I need to be willing to think broadly and so on. So yes, we need systemic thinking. We need it to happen across the world. I love the lesson from Finland. In Finland, they used to ask the question in the 1970s: if you met somebody who was in the 35 to 40 year age group, you'd ask them the question, have you had a heart attack? And the answer would be not yet, because 80 to 85% of them were going to have a heart attack by the time they turned 45.
Wow.
And so the question then was, how do you shift that? How do you change those numbers? And over the last 50 years, Finland has reduced the case of ischemic heart attacks by 75 to 80%. Lung disease has fallen by 85%. And what it took was getting the farmers and the grocers and the schools and the government and the private sector and finance all collaborating together to go after those big goals, because that's the kind of approach that's needed if you want to create systemic change. So we want to learn those lessons, but we want to apply that to today. We want to use the technologies that were not available for them in the 70s. We want to bring them into play, because when I go and talk to the farmers and say, how are you, changing the way you work? Well, there's tech everywhere in how they do it. And it's really exciting to see that. When I talk to the insurance companies, they're using tech and big data everywhere. And what we need to do is find ways in which these different, totally disconnected systems from each other can be connected so that we can be much wiser in our thinking. I'm gonna just share this one thing, and then I'll come to a halt on this in case you have any questions for me. But what is our approach? Somebody could say, what's the North Star way of creating the social tipping points that allow things to progress? And for me, there are these four elements that we want to do. One, we want to bring together people who operate in different parts of the system, because of that issue that we found in Wales, the insurance guys and the water guys and the farmers and so on, all need to hear each other and so on. We need to leverage the diversity of ideas and opinions and challenges that come from that. Secondly, we can't force one solution on all of them, because what's right for one is wrong for everybody else. So the question isn't about saying, let's find an expert who can solve it. There isn't a single expert in the world who can solve these problems. We need the people who are involved in this stuff to learn to practice together so that ideas emerge. And emergent thinking is really, really significant. And it rubbishes the idea that we can solve the carbon problem by finding a few carbon specialists and they'll solve it for us. They cannot. We have to practice this kind of emergent thinking across wide swathes of the system. Then we look for ideas that are really, really exciting, but they might be tiny little ideas, not able to scale up. And instead, what we want to do is to make those ideas viable. So we build communities of practice around those ideas. And we're doing that because there are ways in which, when different groups participate together, they can actually enable something that on its own would not have been viable. They can enable that to survive and grow. And once those communities of practice have developed sufficiently that they can be scaled up, then we need to look at what it takes to scale up at nation scale. So that's our kind of process, if you like. And we think we want to see innovation thrive, but not in one little corner of the system, not in one company. We want to see innovation across the entire planet, across the working of our social, human, economic system. So that's the story of North Star transition.
What I really like is if you can bring qualified people into the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we have too many activists right now that are driving agendas, mm-hmm. right? And who are not willing to consider facts, right? So, I mean, everyone will say, oh, Angela Merkel is a green chancellor. The reality is she's going to leave Germany heavily dependent on Russian gas and lignite, right? In spite of spending God knows how many hundreds of billions on wind and solar. But the activists will say, oh, wind and solar are salvation. It cannot do more than 15 to 20% of most societal needs, right? We have to think about nuclear. We have to think about hydrogen fuel and all that. And unfortunately, you can get someone like Bill Gates to say that, but in the mainstream discussions, you hardly ever hear that, right? So we need to get the activists out. We need to get the true experts more involved in driving decisions.
I would have a slightly different take. The activists are usually representing people who have no voice. And that voice needs to be heard as well. The people who are used to having a voice are usually the people who have done really well out of the system. And so we need a balance. So I wouldn't dismiss the activists, but I wouldn't simply accept the answers from one group anyway. And we tend to kind of just go for whoever's got the most money or the most sparkling piece of kit or whatever it is.
But Jyoti, the activists, maybe this is a US perspective. We tend to be very cynical of bureaucrats. We call them unelected officials, right? And it's the same view on activists. They kind of pretend to be experts. They get their power source from wherever, right? And then suddenly they become quoted everywhere, and suddenly they become pseudo experts. So I
Yeah,
I like what you're thinking, but we need to get, like I said, I want a lot more challenging of every country. You can't just pick on one or two countries, and I want to see much more science, true scientists, unbigoted scientists, rational scientists, who don't just come up with silly ideas like, well, we can just slow down growth. We can't. Reality is we cannot, right? Unless you want revolutions everywhere. We got to balance economic growth with saving the earth, right? So it's, I like what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. Just keep the activists out of it.
No, for me, I want to make sure the various voices are heard, because actually some there are brilliant slivers of innovation coming out of places that normally don't get heard at all. We need to find ways in which we can connect the dots on this. So I hear what you're saying, that we need balance and so on. Yeah, but we can't. I think we look at the world where we are, and this is certainly my issue with a lot of the people involved in corporate governance and reporting. They're looking at their businesses and saying, it's really exciting. We've taken 5 steps further than where we were last year. We've reduced our impact on this, and we are changing the scale of how we use XYZ ingredient, etc. And I'm looking at them and thinking, you know what, guys, we have got a 500-mile journey ahead of us. And you're getting excited about the 5 steps that you're taking. I'm delighted that you're taking those 5 steps, but we have a 500-mile journey. So let me finish with this one little story.
Sure, sure.
And it's this. One of my colleagues in North Star Transition was in the World Kayaking Championship final. So he's a pretty decent man when it comes to boats. But the picture we look at is that we're all in a rowboat. It's a fun corporate evening, and we've got our little waistcoats on, and we've got a glass of wine in our hands, and the water is absolutely calm. And it's all pretty and beautiful, and we're really thrilled to be there. The only thing is there's this little bit of a rumble that's going on, and we're not sure what it is. But that rumble is actually the side of the dam that supports the lake collapsing. And what's about to happen is that our little rowboat is about to go down a level 5 or level 6 rapid. That's how my friend describes it. And he says that if you have someone who's never negotiated a level 5 or level 6 rapid in their life before, and they get to do it for the first time, they will die. That is it's as simple as that. And so the analogy for me is that humanity is sitting in this little rowboat. We're thrilled with our lives and we're excited about where it's going. We know there are problems and there's a rumble in the background. But you know what? We're coming to a level 5 or level 6 rapid. We have no idea it's there, and we've never negotiated before. And if we try and do it without the prep and without the help and guidance that we need, we get to die. So that's the little picture I want to share with you. It's a disappointing picture to end with, but that's where we are. We need to be realistic about the risks, and we need to be courageous about the ambitions we're going for.
Well, and that's a great analogy. My point would be, if he had that much panic, and I'm not as panicked as you are, but let's say we should be that panicked. how come we don't tell China 2060 is not acceptable? Why have you just accepted the statement that 2060 is going to be fine? They are the biggest single polluter today, not just in terms of emissions, in terms of all the other discharges and so on, right?
You know what?
You know,
All the countries. Well, I live in the UK, which is committed to 2050, and I could say, you know what? We'll be 20 years too late. We have to do this by 2030.
well, but
So, you
my,
know,
my
the
point is,
challenge is huge.
my point is, we tend to be picky on who we go after. You know, and in your case, you're challenging corporations to do more. My point is, ask governments to do more. Why aren't we? Not just on emissions, but trade, immigration, you know, the whole 17 UN sustainable goals. Every
But
one of them should be
Vinny, that's the point that I've learned on systemic innovation. If you go to government, what you're going to miss out on is ambition because their ambitions are not big enough. And you're going to miss out on time horizon because their time horizons are so short. It's a 2-year time horizon to the next election. It's a 4-year horizon, whatever. What we need is the ambitions to go after really big things and the time horizon that says, actually, we've got 20 years or 30 years to fix it. Let's be serious about every single year from now. Whereas in the UK, the government made a decision that it's the Theresa May government made a decision to, that it was put into law, the net zero by 2050 was put into law by her government. The Boris Johnson Tory government that stood for election the next time round had zero about carbon in its manifesto. Why? Because that's 2050's problem, man. We don't have to worry about it right now. So you know what? For me, their ambitions are not strong enough, and that time horizon is pitifully short. So I don't want to waste time depending on government. I'd rather we get the job done outside government and then take it to government and say, hey guys, here's a pre-package. It's already sorted. Now go and do your bit, which is you can scale it up.
Jyoti, go to Putin and Modi and China just as much as you're expecting of the Western world. So
excellent. Let's do it.
This is great. Clearly, it's not just us. It's for our kids, our grandkids, and so on. I don't think anyone has evil in their mind, right? It's just we all need to get serious. And
That's
I
right.
get frustrated that we don't call out. There's bad behavior in so many countries. Having been to 70 countries, I can tell you about weaknesses in every one of them. You don't hear about that, right?
Mm.
So I'd like to see a little more balance in terms of expecting everyone to step up. At least, well, not everyone, at least the top 25 countries.
Super. Vinny, thank you for
Thank you
the
so much.
opportunity to have this chat. I really appreciated that.
And next time you can come and talk more about the corporate reporting and so on. That'd be fun to go through.
Well, we have a finance transition lab, which is really asking the question, how do we shift the global financial system with its 90 trillion in capital markets? How do we shift that away from a degenerative system, which is what we have today, to a regenerative system? And that's our main exploration at the moment.
That'd be fantastic to have you come back and talk about that. Thank you, Jyoti. Always a pleasure. We shouldn't wait another 10 years to talk again.
Let's see what we can do to speed it up.
Thank you, Jyoti.